The exact moment a man realizes he has become invisible to his own family does not happen with a shout or a fight. It happens quietly, across a polished mahogany dining table, while a man in an expensive suit slides a thick white envelope toward you, like he is tipping a waiter who took too long with the water. "Just signed the release, Richard," my son-in-law, Ethan, said, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. "It clears up the trust liability for the Wright-Patterson project. And honestly, at 72, you shouldn't be worrying about property titles or corporate guarantees anyway. We'll handle the heavy lifting from here." Across the table, Ethan's father, Vance. Vance Senior didn't even look up from his prime rib. He just took a slow sip of his Cabernet, set the glass down on a linen coaster, and tapped the edge of the envelope with 2 fingers. "It's for the best, Richard," Vance added, his tone dripping with the kind of condescending pity reserved for old men who drive decade-old pickup trucks. "We're cleaning up the balance sheets for the firm. A retired small-town mechanic shouldn't have his name attached to a $30 million commercial development. It makes the underwriters nervous." I didn't reach for the envelope right away. I sat there in Vance's dining room in the historic district of Columbus, listening to the grandfather clock ticking against the wallpaper and the faint hum of the traffic on Broad Street. I looked down at my hands, calloused, weathered, and scarred from 40 years of hard physical work and 34 years in uniform. I looked at the old stainless steel Hamilton field watch resting against my left wrist. The strap was worn dark from sweat and oil. A simple military issue piece I had worn through 3 deployments and 2 decades of quiet civilian life. Before I tell you what was actually inside that envelope and what happened when I opened it, please leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. I live in Yellow Springs, Ohio, about 45 minutes west of Columbus. It's a quiet town of mature oak trees, small gravel driveways, and people who mind their own business. My home is a modest wood frame house with a small mechanical shop built onto the back of the garage. I drive a 2004 Ford F-150 with a dented tailgate and 210,000 miles on the odometer. Most mornings, you can find me at the local hardware store buying stainless fasteners, or in my workshop replacing the lawnmower carburetors and hydraulic pumps for local farmers who can't afford dealership rates. To the people in Yellow Springs, I am just Richard Walker, the quiet widower who minds his garden, fixes what's broken, and wears the same faded M65 field jacket every winter. And that was exactly how I wanted it. When my wife Eleanor passed away 6 years ago, she left me with one primary instruction regarding our daughter, Emily. Eleanor had spent her entire life watching the military culture swallow people whole. On her deathbed, she gripped my hand and whispered, "Let Emily live a normal life, Richard. Don't let your past sit on her shoulders like a weight. Let her choose a man for who he is, not for who her father was." I kept that promise. When Emily met Ethan Vance 4 years ago, I didn't interfere. Ethan was ambitious, smooth-talking, and obsessed with the markers of success: tailored suits, private club memberships, and constant talk about equity offerings and commercial real estate acquisitions. Emily was a head nurse at the community hospital, dedicated, kind, and fiercely independent. She loved Ethan because she saw a driven man who wanted to build a legacy. She didn't see the entitlement beneath it. Ethan certainly didn't see me. From the first Sunday dinner he attended at my house, he drew his own conclusions. He saw my grease-stained work boots by the door, the simple furniture, the old truck in the gravel drive, and he categorized me instantly, a sweet, simple old man who had spent his life barely getting by as a small-time mechanic. I never corrected him. If a man measures your worth solely by the car you drive or the label on your jacket, telling him the truth won't make him respect you. It will only make him calculating. The cracks in the foundation began showing about 8 months ago. Ethan's firm, Vance Development, had aggressively expanded into commercial properties near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They were trying to secure a multi-million-dollar land deal to build a high-end commercial complex aimed at defense contractors. But Ethan had overextended. He had taken out massive private credit lines, using his father's banking connections as leverage. Every time Ethan visited Yellow Springs, his condescension toward me grew stronger, masked as helpful concern. "Richard, you really need to let us get you a modern vehicle," Ethan had said one Saturday afternoon, standing in my driveway while I was greasing the front suspension on my Ford. "It's embarrassing when Emily's colleagues see this truck parked outside her house. People assume I'm letting my father-in-law live in poverty." "The truck runs fine, Ethan," I replied evenly, wiping my hands on the shop rack. "It carries what I need, and it's paid for." "That's a small-minded way to look at capital, Richard." Ethan smiled, that patronizing, polished smile he used whenever he thought he was teaching a lesson. "Appearance is collateral in our world. If you look broke, people assume you are broke." Emily had stepped out onto the porch then, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Leave him alone, Ethan," she said gently, stepping down to hand me a mug. "Dad built this house, and he likes his truck. He doesn't need to impress anyone." Ethan had just chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just saying, family reputation matters. My father is hosting the annual holiday dinner next week with the Regional Investment Board. I just hope Richard wears a proper suit this time." Emily looked at me with a soft, apologetic expression. She loved her husband, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She was working 60 hours a week at the hospital, while Ethan was constantly reshuffling debt to maintain the illusion of absolute wealth. What Ethan and his father didn't know was that 3 weeks before that Christmas dinner, a legal document had landed on my desk in Yellow Springs. It came directly from the Private Oversight Committee monitoring commercial land transfers adjacent to Wright-Patterson. Because the proposed Vance development project bordered federal military property, the acquisition required high-level security clearance and financial transparency vetting. Attached to the file was an application where Ethan had listed Emily's personal assets, including the irrevocable family land trust her mother had established for her as corporate backing for his loans. Worse, Vance Senior's legal team had quietly drafted a post-nuptial agreement and asset waiver, designed to strip Emily of her independent oversight while locking my small residential property into a cross-collateralization guarantee. They thought I was an uneducated, naive old mechanic who wouldn't read the small print. They thought if they put enough pressure on Emily and handed me a pen in a room full of wealthy strangers, I would sign whatever they put in front of me, just to avoid causing a scene. They had built a complete fantasy about who I was, based entirely on my silence. As I sat at Vance's long mahogany table on that cold December evening, listening to the clinking of crystal glasses and the quiet arrogance of 2 men who thought they had backed me into a corner, I reached into my coat pocket. I didn't pull out a pen. I pulled out a small, dark leather case, worn at the corners, and set it directly on top of the white envelope Vance had slid across the table. Below is part 2 of the script for story_general_envelope_001. It is written in natural, spoken American English, formatted cleanly for TTS reading, and fully aligned with all locked canon, scene cards, and continuity rules from your approved master outline and story Bible. The dining room went completely still. Ethan stopped with his wine glass halfway to his lips, his blue eyes narrowing as he stared at the dark leather case resting on top of his father's white envelope. Across the mahogany table, Vance Senior set his fork down with a sharp, metallic click against the china. "What is that, Richard?" Ethan asked, letting out a short, dismissive breath. "If that's another old repair receipt or a deed to your garage, we really don't have time for this tonight. We need these signatures before the banking offices close for the holiday weekend." "It's not a receipt, Ethan," I said gently, keeping my hands resting flat on the table on either side of my plate. "It's good luck." Beside me, Emily shifted in her chair. She looked at the envelope, then at me, her fingers tightening around her napkin. She didn't know what was inside the leather case either. For 4 years, she had only known me as the quiet old man who fixed hydraulic pumps, made her fresh coffee when she came home exhausted from 12-hour hospital shifts, and drove an old truck with a dented tailgate. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice laced with concern. "What are they asking you to sign?" Vance Senior leaned forward, adjusting the silk tie beneath his charcoal blazer. He smiled, but it was the cold, clinical smile of a man who believed every human interaction was merely a transaction where he held all the leverage. "It's simple family restructuring, Emily," Vance said smoothly, turning his attention to my daughter. "Ethan's development firm is expanding into the Wright-Patterson commercial corridor. To satisfy the private equity underwriters, we need to ensure all family assets are properly aligned. Your father's property in Yellow Springs sits right near the secondary access route. We're simply incorporating his parcel into the overarching trust guarantee to secure our commercial loan terms." "And in plain English?" I asked, looking Vance directly in the eyes. Vance didn't flinch. "In plain English, Richard, you're 72. You live on a fixed pension, and whatever cash locals hand you for fixing lawnmowers, you cannot maintain that property long-term. By transferring the title into Vance Development's asset umbrella, Ethan guarantees your housing for life, while we leverage the land value to close a $30 million deal. It's a win-win. Unless, of course, you'd rather let that land sit idle while your daughter works 60 hours a week paying off student loans." There it was, the hook, the subtle, cruel twist of the knife, designed to make me feel small, obsolete, and guilty for existing. There, Ethan nodded in agreement, leaning back in his leather chair. "Look, Richard, my dad's being generous. Most board members wouldn't even offer a lifetime lease option to a small-town mechanic. We're doing this to keep things in the family, but the bank needs the signed release and the cross-collateral guarantee tonight." I didn't raise my voice. In 34 years of military service, I had learned that the loudest man in the room is usually the most panicked. True authority doesn't need to shout. It simply waits for the noise to stop. I unbuttoned the worn leather strap of the small case. I participate. "You mentioned the Wright-Patterson project, Vance," I said, my voice level and steady. "You mentioned that your underwriters are requiring high-level security clearance and financial transparency vetting because the commercial corridor borders federal military property." Vance's eyebrows twitched upward slightly. He glanced at Ethan, then back at me. "I didn't realize a small-town mechanic understood federal zoning protocol." "I understand a great deal about federal protocol," I replied quietly. I opened the leather case. Inside, resting against dark velvet, was an official Department of Defense identification card, bordered in gold oak leaves and stamped with the seal of the United States Armed Forces. Above my photograph were 3 words printed in clear, bold text: General Richard Walker, United States Army, retired. Beneath it was the 4-star rank emblem. Beside the identification card sat an official brass seal, the emblem of the Private Financial Oversight and Land Security Committee for the Department of Defense Logistics Command. Vance Senior stared at the card. His face didn't turn pale immediately. First, his eyes widened as his brain tried to process the disconnect between the man sitting before him in a faded field jacket and the document resting on his table. "What prostitute? What is this?" Ethan asked, chuckling nervously as he reached out to pick up the case. "Is this some kind of joke? Richard, did you print this online?" "Don't touch it, Ethan," I said. "Ethan," I didn't yell. I used the exact tone I used to command 10,000 troops across 3 deployment zones. Ethan's hand froze in midair. His fingers hovered 2 inches from the leather case, his confidence evaporating in an instant. Vance Senior slowly stood up from his chair. His Cabernet glass trembled slightly, sending a tiny red ripple across the white tablecloth. As a former investment banker who had dealt with government defense contracts, Vance recognized the gold leaf seal instantly. He knew what that card meant. He knew that the chairman of the Advisory Oversight Board for all commercial development bordering Wright-Patterson was not an anonymous bureaucrat in Washington. It was the man whose truck he had mocked 20 minutes earlier. "General Walker," Vance stammered, his voice dropping an entire octave, losing every trace of its polished arrogance. You're Richard Walker." "I am," I said calmly, looking at both of them. And before you ask Ethan to explain paragraph 14 of your contract, let me explain what actually happened 3 weeks ago. The silence in that dining room was no longer the polite, heavy quiet of an uncomfortable family dinner. It was the absolute, suffocating stillness that occurs right before a dam breaks. Ethan's mouth remained slightly open. His eyes darted back and forth between the 4-star general identification card lying inside the leather case and my face, searching desperately for any sign that this was an elaborate, impossible bluff. Vance Senior, however, was not looking for a bluff. His face had turned a dull, chalky gray. He knew the military procurement ecosystem inside and out. He knew that 3 weeks earlier, the Defense Logistics Command had initiated a secondary financial audit on all private land acquisitions bordering the Wright-Patterson commercial corridor. He had spent 21 days trying to find out which high-ranking federal official had personally flagged Vance Development's filing for predatory cross-collateralization. Now he was looking at him across his own table. "You," Vance breathed out, his voice thin and hollow. "You're the chairman of the Advisory Oversight Board." "I am," I said, keeping my hands resting flat on the table. "And 3 weeks ago, when your corporate application crossed my desk for security vetting, I noticed something interesting. You listed my daughter's personal estate, the irrevocable land trust her late mother created for her, as guaranteed corporate equity to secure a $30 million credit line." Emily turned her head sharply toward Ethan. The color drained from her cheeks. "Ethan, is that true? You told me those documents were just routine tax declarations." Ethan didn't answer her. He couldn't. Sweat was already beginning to glisten along his hairline. "They didn't just list Emily's trust, sweetheart," I said gently, looking at my daughter. "They needed a third-party guarantor to meet the federal liquidity ratio. That's why Vance slid this white envelope across the table tonight. Inside paragraph 14, which they assumed a retired small-town mechanic would never read, is a full asset transfer agreement. If I signed it, my residential parcel in Yellow Springs would be pledged to back Ethan's loan default risk. And if I refused, they prepared a post-nuptial waiver designed to strip you of your legal voting rights in the family trust entirely." Emily stood up so fast, her dining chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "You tried to steal my mother's trust. You tried to trick my father into risking his home." "Emily, listen to me. It's not what it looks like," Ethan stammered, stepping toward her with his hands raised. "It's a corporate strategy. We were going to pay it back once the land was developed." "Quiet, Ethan," Vance Senior snapped, his voice sharp with pure panic. He turned to me, lowering his posture, his hands trembling as he rested them on the edge of the mahogany table. "General Walker, Richard, please, we can discuss this like reasonable businessmen. We didn't know your background. Ethan was just trying to secure the project before the end-of-year deadline." "You didn't know my background, Vance, because I chose not to advertise it." I interrupted softly. "I spent 34 years serving this country. When I retired, I wanted a simple life. I wanted to fix small engines, drive my truck, and enjoy my peace. But my late wife taught me that a man's character is revealed when he thinks nobody is watching. For 4 years, I watched how you and your son treated me when you thought I was worthless. And more importantly, I watched how you treated my daughter." Right on cue, the vintage Hamilton watch on my left wrist ticked quietly. My cell phone, sitting on the table beside my plate, buzzed against the wood. The caller ID displayed a direct line from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Command. I picked up the phone, tapped the speaker button, and set it down in the center of the table. "General Walker, sir." Colonel Miller's voice echoed clearly through the quiet room. "This is Colonel Miller from Logistics Command. We've completed the secondary audit on the Vance Development commercial proposal bordering the North Gate, as you requested." Vance Senior looked like he was about to faint. Ethan took 2 steps backward until his spine hit the mahogany sideboard. "Go ahead, Colonel," I said evenly. "The committee has flagged multiple financial irregularities, unauthorized asset cross-collateralization, and high-risk leverage structures, sir." Colonel Miller reported briskly. Per federal procurement regulations, the Advisory Oversight Board has officially denied Vance Development's zoning clearance. The formal rejection notice has been dispatched to the State Banking Authority and their underwriting primary lead. All commercial permits for that corridor are frozen indefinitely. Understood, Colonel, I replied. Thank you for the prompt review. Understood. General Dama, standing by if you need anything further. Sir. I ended the call. The dining room was completely dead silent. The $30 million deal that Ethan and Vance Senior had staked their entire company's reputation, credit, and future on had just evaporated into thin air in less than 40 seconds. Vance Senior dropped heavily back into his chair, staring blankly at his cold plate of prime rib. Ethan looked at me, his face twisted in a pathetic mixture of disbelief, horror, and sudden, desperate regret. Dad. Richard. Please, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. If the bank sees that rejection notice, our credit lines will be called in by Monday. We'll lose the firm. Everything we built. You didn't build anything, Ethan, I said, picking up the leather case with my identification card and closing the brass clasp. You borrowed against other people's sacrifices and called it success. I picked up the white envelope Vance had slid across the table, folded it once without signing a single page, and handed it directly to my daughter. Emily, I said softly, looking her in the eyes. Let's go home. The heavy oak front door of Vance's mansion closed behind us with a soft, solid thud. The cold December night air hit my face like a clean, physical wake-up call. Out on the quiet, tree-lined street of the historic district, breath fogged in front of us. I walked down the stone steps at a steady, unhurried pace, my old Hamilton field watch ticking faithfully against my wrist. Emily walked beside me, holding the unopened white envelope against her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. For 4 years, she had carried the silent, emotional burden of trying to bridge two entirely different worlds, her husband's world of superficial status and my world of simple, grounded truth. Tonight, the bridge had collapsed, and for the first time in years, her shoulders didn't look hunched under the weight. We reached my 2004 Ford F-150 parked at the curb. I unlocked the passenger side door for her. Dad, she said softly, stopping before she got in. She looked at the dented tailgate, then back at me. You never told me. In 4 years, you never said a word about your 4 stars or the oversight board or any of it. Your mother wanted you to build a life on your own terms. Emily, I replied, pulling my old M65 field jacket tighter against the wind. She wanted you to fall in love with a man for who he was, not because of what your father's title could buy him. I gave Ethan every opportunity to show me who he was. He chose to show me tonight. She looked down at the white envelope in her hands, her thumb tracing the paper. He didn't love me, Dad. He loved the idea of using me to get what he couldn't earn. Then you haven't lost anything tonight, sweetheart, I said gently. You only stopped paying for a lie. She nodded once, a clear, decisive nod that told me her mother's strength was alive and well inside her. She climbed into the truck. I walked around to the driver's side, started the engine, and turned the heater on. The old V8 Rumbler kicked to life without a stutter, and we drove away from the Vance estate, leaving the chaos behind us. What followed over the next 3 months was not a loud, dramatic war, but the quiet, relentless mechanics of consequence. Now, when you strip away borrowed credit and false appearances, a house built on leverage doesn't fall down with a bang, it simply dissolves. Within 48 hours of Colonel Miller's official rejection notice, the primary underwriting bank called in Vance Development's existing commercial credit lines. Without the Wright-Patterson corridor project to promise investors, the firm had no liquidity left to cover its short-term debts. Vance Senior attempted to use his old private banking connections to pause the foreclosure. But federal audit flags don't disappear because of a phone call. Within 6 weeks, Vance Development was forced to sell off its speculative land holdings at a loss to satisfy institutional creditors. Vance Senior quietly retired from his remaining board positions to avoid further public scrutiny. Ethan tried calling Emily twice during the first week. He left long, panicked voicemails on her phone, pivoting from desperate pleas for a second chance to furious accusations that I had ruined his career. Emily listened to the first message, deleted the second without playing it, and changed her phone number. By mid-January, Emily had retained her own independent family law attorney. Because Ethan's legal team had unwittingly provided full documentation of their intent to misappropriate her personal family assets in that white envelope, the divorce proceedings were clean, quiet, and swift. Emily walked away with her independent nurse's salary, her pride, and total control over her personal life. She moved out of Columbus and took a small, bright house 3 streets over from mine in Yellow Springs. She said, "As for me, I went back to my shop behind the garage." On a crisp Tuesday afternoon in March, the sun was warm against the gravel driveway. I was sitting at my workbench, replacing a worn throttle cable on a local farmer's riding mower. The air smelled of clean engine oil, fresh coffee, and spring mud. A shadow crossed the doorway. I looked up. Ethan was standing at the edge of the shop. He wasn't wearing his tailored charcoal suit. He wore jeans and a plain dark jacket, his hair slightly unkempt, his face carrying the distinct, tired look of a man who had finally run out of excuses. He didn't step inside. He just stood on the gravel. "Richard," he said quietly. "Ethan," I replied, setting my wrench down on the wooden workbench. He looked around the simple shop at the wall of hand tools, the grease-stained rags, the old radio playing soft country music in the corner. For 4 years, he had looked at this room and seen a symbol of failure. Now, he looked at it like a man trying to understand a language he had never bothered to learn. The firm dissolved last Tuesday, Ethan said, his voice completely devoid of its old polish. "We sold the office on Broad Street. My dad and I aren't speaking much right now." I stayed silent, listening. I came to ask if I could see Emily," he continued, looking down at his shoes. "I just want to apologize to her. Without lawyers, without contracts." I leaned back against the workbench and looked at him steadily. "No, Emily is working her shift at the hospital." "Ethan," I said, my tone calm and even. "And she's doing very well. But an apology isn't something you deliver to make yourself feel better about the damage you left behind. An apology is something you prove by living differently when nobody is watching." Ethan swallowed hard. "You think I'm a bad man, don't you?" "No," I answered, glancing down at my old Hamilton field watch. "I think you're a man who confused winning with value. You thought respect was something you could take from people who didn't look like you. Life doesn't work that way, son. You have to earn it, one honest day at a time." He stood there for another long moment, processing the quiet finality of my words. There was no anger left in him to fight with, no pitch to make, no leverage to use. He simply nodded slowly, turned around, and walked back down the gravel driveway. I didn't watch him go. I picked up my wrench and went back to fixing the throttle cable. Around 5 o'clock, a blue sedan pulled up. Emily stepped out, holding a brown paper bag from the bakery in town. She walked into the shop, smelled the fresh coffee, and set 2 warm cinnamon rolls on the corner of my bench. "Thought you might be ready for a break, Dad," she smiled. "I'm always ready for a break when there's cinnamon rolls involved," I said, wiping my hands on a shop towel. We sat together on 2 wooden stools by the open garage door, watching the sun dip low over the Ohio fields. The quiet wasn't heavy or awkward anymore. It was the comfortable, honest peace of 2 people who knew exactly where they stood, who they were, and what truly mattered. Some men spend their entire lives chasing power, wearing expensive suits, and demanding respect from every room they walk into. But true strength doesn't need a microphone, a board seat, or a title on a door. True strength is knowing who you are when the noise stops and having the courage to protect the people who depend on you, without ever needing to brag about the sacrifice. If my story reminded you of the value of quiet dignity and standing up for your family, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to set a firm boundary with someone who mistook your silence for weakness? I'd love to read your stories. Thank you for watching. Take care of your loved ones and stand steady.